I'm Peter Stonham, Editorial Director of Landlord Links LTT. We're delighted the way this series has gone. We've built up a regular audience for virtually everyone amongst some people, and then specialist subjects have attracted other people. Today we're doing buses. We're doing buses because buses are important, but we're doing buses because buses are in an interesting place at the moment because of the pandemic. We've got some very short-term issues on social distancing and service support that's needed in a time of reduced patronage. We've got some medium-term issues about bringing buses back into the fold of what would be called normal mobility patterns and without the government health warning on them. And in the long term, we're probably learning some things for the future about how to get the best out of buses and the relationship between the operators and the public authorities. I'll make a quip here. President Xi would say one country, two systems. And I'd probably say one country, two systems for buses in the UK, with London being one system and everywhere else a different system, except that everywhere else there's nuances emerging of different systems as well, in terms of partnerships between local authorities and the operators of different forms, and that's something we'll be discussing today. So I'm very pleased to have you with us. We've just passed 60 attendees, and I expect there'll be a few more coming. And I'd now like to hand over to Andrew Forster, editor of LTT, to host the discussion.
Thanks very much, Peter. Maybe just a few words to start with from me very briefly. Before COVID-19, we were certainly looking at a very different picture for the bus industry. We had Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, quite pro-bus. We had a talk of a national bus strategy coming along the line. We also had new funding streams for all electric bus town and rural mobility fund, super bus networks, more money for tendered services. So it was all looking quite rosy. And then we also had the regulatory debate was very alive, led by Greater Manchester, who were on the verge of confirming their intention to go for bus franchising. And then along came COVID-19 and it's kind of knocked everything for six. And we now in a totally different landscape. We've had the 12-week first phase of COVID bus service support grant, which was worth 167 million to ensure services were up to about 40 to 50% outside London. That's been just replaced by the COVID bus service support grant restart fund, which is an open-ended fund initially for 12 weeks, but could go on for longer, paying 254 million over the 12 weeks to restore services to 100% levels outside London. We will hear from London today, and they've obviously had their financial assistance, which takes them up to, I think it's mid-September from the government. So that's where we are. And just one other point to support the grant, we've obviously have the government maintaining BSOG payments and asking local authorities to maintain reimbursement and subsidised service payments to operators at pre-COVID levels, which I know has caused some tensions with local authorities who face their own wider financial challenges. So look, that's it from me. Let's go to the presentations. We've got 6 speakers. Each of them have been asked to speak for 5 minutes. I'll try and keep you to that. And they come from, operators, local authority angle, and also passenger representatives. So first up is James Freeman, who's Managing Director of First West of England.
And a very good afternoon. I'm going to share my screen. Am I okay to do that? Let's see if it works. See if we can find the thing in the first place. Looks hopeful. Let's go to the start of the show. There we are. Good. Okay. So the future of bus services. The first thing to say is that I now know what it's like to work in the cigarette production industry, in that we have now got the government putting notices, not quite notices on our buses saying this is dangerous, but the Prime Minister himself has led off by saying, do not use public transport. And although he put in parenthesis, unless it's really essential, actually, people have really taken him at his word, and we've noticed the effect of that. Having said that, although that's very uncomfortable, on the other hand, compared to a restaurant proprietor or somebody involved in anywhere in the catering or entertainment world, we are sitting pretty in the bus business in that we are being funded to carry on doing what we need to do. But just to give a picture of what's happened to our patronage, on this graph, the blue line is our patronage, and it, as you can see, drops like a stone to a very low level at 9%. And although this is actually quite an old slide, it bumped along at the bottom right the way to the present time, with only a very, very gentle increase at the most present time. So what that did was a whole lot of things about the way that we operate our services, aimed at trying to keep up really with a constant stream of changing rules and ideas and announcements and public perceptions. But the really important and interesting thing about this is that the effect has been, oddly, to bring us much closer to our teams and to improve the quality of our delivery of what we are able to deliver. So that's a very odd result, frankly. One of the things that became obvious that we're going to have to do was to work out where people could sit on our buses when social distancing was taken into account. To begin with, this wasn't a problem because, of course, we had quite enough empty space in our buses to please everybody. But as the numbers started to creep back up, there were one or two journeys beginning to become a problem. So we analysed our whole fleet and we set out a plan for each fleet member so that we could see where people could sit. And indeed, the result was a 20-seater double-decker, really, a 7-seater solo, almost hardly worth turning up with, and a different sort of picture altogether. What's been interesting about this is that the users have generally said, thank you. This does actually show that somebody cares about us and we like the discipline. There are a few nutcases, people who must sit on the seat that says don't sit here, but for most people, this actually gives them a bit of sense. The issue of capacity, on the other hand, a bus that's only got 20 spaces will quickly fill up. We're very excited that this week we've been able to bring out an app which allows people to see not only where their bus is when it's coming towards them, but how many seats it has on it. That's been incredibly well received locally. The feedback has been really stunning. So here's a thought. We have 72% of our network operating. The patronage is just 13% in the west of England, but our capacity at 72% is only about 20% of what it would have been pre-COVID. And then 5th of July, we're going to bring out everybody who's left to drive the buses we've got left. That takes it to 25% capacity. What's going to happen when more people than that want to travel? So it seems to me that going forward, this social distancing thing is absolutely key to what's going to happen in the short term. And I don't know quite where that's leading. And I also think that until you can go into a cinema and sit down next to a person who's a stranger next to you, this won't come right. Until they've got a vaccine, we're going to be messing with this and messing with it and messing with it. And on the other hand, we've got people working from home and lots and lots and lots of them in this part of the world, a great number of them. We've got the growth of active travel. You know, I wish I was selling bicycles as a sideline. Fantastic business. And even the car people are rubbing their hands with glee at the moment. And so it's clear that to keep the public transport business running, it's going to cost lots of money. And I do find myself wondering what's going to happen when the money runs out or somebody says, is it worth all that money? So that's my starter, Andrew. Thank you very much. I hand the throne back to you.
Thank you very much. That was a perfect introduction there for the debate. Just before I introduce the next speaker, can I just say that most people will be familiar with the chat facility at the bottom of the screen. If you want to raise anything, if there's anything you want to raise when you're hearing this, maybe a question you want to ask when the discussion opens up, just put it on there and I'll take a read of it and we'll try and get them all covered. So second up, Jonathan Bray, Director of the Urban Transport Group. Over to you, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you. So what I was going to do is just look at where we are now, the issues around the restart and recovery period, and then look into the future. So where we are now, well, as we all know, and as James was pointing out, we've got rid of most of the passengers. The industry is now nearly entirely public funded, in our areas mostly by local government. Bus deregulation wasn't really too active before, but now it's not happening at all in terms of competition. And also, as James was pointing out, we're in danger of demonising the mode in a way that sticks in people's minds that might be hard to claw back later. So that's where we are right now. I think during the restart and recovery phase, I think the industry is probably going to have to super demonstrate on hygiene. And when I say the industry, I think public transport as a whole. There's obviously some very good practice, but are we in a space where we need a guarantee across all modes of public transport in all areas on the hygiene standards that are being implemented and communicated? Because I think as people are trip chaining, as people have concerns and fears about using public transport, they're going to want to feel that, yes, it has actually been cleaned thoroughly. So do we need that kind of baseline guarantee across the modes? Do we need to get ahead of the curve? I think one thing that I've learned during COVID-19 is things that seem ridiculous and unreasonable 1 week are almost inevitably going to happen in a couple of weeks. And we had that yesterday, compulsory face coverings. So should we be getting ahead of the game, particularly as we can see how things are going to unfold over the next 4 months, as long as there's not another spike, as more and more cohorts of passengers and journey purposes come back. Funding flows, I think we need to reorganise the funding flows to the industry in a way that recognises the reality. At the moment, local government is being asked to reimburse for concessionary passengers that aren't travelling, for attended services that aren't running, for school services that aren't being provided. There is a better way of doing this by routing the funding and using the meta areas via the city regions. So people are paying for something that's that you can follow the flow through, and also enables you to better plan public transport as a whole, given the severe challenges of social distancing across the modes, in a way that is very difficult to do at present. The third thing about the restart and recovery phase is temporary road space reallocation. Personally and as an organisation, I think it's great that we are seeing and encouraging more people to walk and cycle, but we need to ensure that that isn't done in a way that jeopardises the recovery of the bus, and we don't end up with, active travel kind of circling the corpse of the bus. We're doing our best through our channels in local government to do that, and we'll continue to seek to do that, to try and square these circles about road space reallocation. I think moving on to the future, it's going to be tough. It's going to be very tough. It wasn't looking so great for the bus in many ways before COVID-19 in terms of what was happening on patches and travel trends. And now we've got rid of all the passengers. We've set the base low. So if we carry on what we were doing before, we'll be starting from a much lower base. And it's not hard to see what the consequences of that might be. So it is tough. I think it's looking much brighter for active travel and for cars. You can see more people travelling by car. You can see more people taking trips by bike and walking, maybe at the same time, but in different areas. More driving in the suburbs, more walking and cycling in the city centres and the inner suburbs, and public transport getting squeezed, particularly the bus. It's going to be tough. So I think we need to find ways of segueing out of this period into reimagining what the bus is for and can do. And some of these things we don't quite know yet, because we don't know what's going to happen to wider patches and travel trends. We don't know to what extent commuting is going to return to where it was. We don't know whether the impacts of home working, the different types of travel trips that you get if more people are working from home, but we don't know if that's going to happen yet. So, but do we need to reimagine the bus as something that takes its place within a wider urban green economies, something that's simpler to use, that's cheaper to use, that is more consistent, something that has a higher subsidy level, something a bit more akin to what is the norm in most counterpart countries, where you do have something that is directed by the Transport Authority, is generally cheaper, and is that somewhere where we're going to be? And if we don't, what will be the likely trend line continuation? I think the other thing we must ensure is that the bus is part of any Green New Deal. I think most politicians are saying that they want the economic revival to be a green economic revival. And central to that, I believe, is greening the grid and electrification of transport. And that includes greening the bus and putting that not behind where the car is, but ahead of the car. And also having a consistent strategy for that rather than finding the money to do it when it's available has been the trend so far. So making sure that the bus is central to that wider national project of a green economic revival based on, or at least partly based on, greening the grid and the electrification of transport. And I think as part of that as well, we need to be segueing to a position where it's easier for transport authorities to go down the route of either franchising or continuing with some further iteration of the current arrangements, or towards direct provision in some form or another. So I think the final thing I would say is, if we can't be bold, if we can't think big now, then when are we going to do it? And if we don't think big and we don't think bold, then the legacy of COVID-19 will determine our future rather than us determining that future.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Some excellent interesting points there. If anyone's got the their mic on, could they turn it off? That'd be great. Right. Third up, Jeff Hobbs, Director of Public Service Transport Planning at Transport for London. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you very much. So in London, we've seen a very big fall in aggregate passenger numbers on the buses, down 85% over much of the last 11 weeks. That compares to the Underground, which was down by as much as 95%, and National Rail, which is roundly 90%. Just as an aside, cycle hire is going through an incredible boom. We've never ever had such high numbers, especially weekends and around royal parks, for what that's worth. Different trends in different parts of London. There's an earlier peak than we've seen before, particularly 6:30 to 7 o'clock, and sort of zone 2 areas busier than central London. We find out newly that 62% of public transport users can actually work from home, but that's distributed unevenly, and it's often the heavier distribution of office people in and around central London who are most able to do that, rather than other types of travellers. As we went into lockdown, we reduced the service, so from a weekday to a Saturday service, and then from a Saturday to a Sunday service. Now we're reversing that. When schools closed, we took away the school services, and again, they are now all reintroduced. So we're running about 85% of the normal vehicle kilometres at the moment, and that's expected to increase in the near future over the next 4 weeks, much higher and approaching to 100% over the course of the next month or two. The dawning realisation a couple of months ago of the impact of social distancing was an extraordinary moment, insofar as the fact that a double-decker with a notional capacity of about 87 could carry about 20 people instead, single-decker less so. And you realised that all the normal rules of transport planning were suddenly upended as a result. And that was a very big deal indeed, not just for buses, but also in my other role for the Underground and our rail modes. And as a result, we had to think about how we were going to try and manage that. At the moment, given the levels of demand, that's not too tricky. And also there's a whole series of mitigations that we've introduced over the course of the last 11 weeks. So Jonathan's already mentioned face coverings, soon to be compulsory from a week on Monday. Initially a move to middle door boarding, but now with the insulation of the cab area and some astonishingly detailed modelling on how airflows go through buses, the augmented screen to allow the driver to be safely insulated, seats cordoned off, a new cleaning regime with antiviral products, signage at bus stations and bus stops, means to count the maximum number of passengers on a bus, lots of encouragement to active travel, a streetscape plan to reallocate road space so that social distancing is as possible for pedestrians as it is for everyone else. And that's now reached 15,000 square metres, places like City of London, Park Lane, Stoke Newington, Brixton, many others, and changes to concessions in the fairly near future. We've also, of course, restarted the congestion charge, noting that traffic levels are only 20% down, which is quite different from the situation on public transport. We've got all sorts of trigger points in the future as the lockdown is likely to be relaxed in the future. So we're anticipating the growth of demand again. We're undertaking all sorts of modelling to try and make sure that forewarned is forearmed. We also anticipate that if and when a vaccine is developed and to use the now hackneyed phrase, new normal is established and social distancing is no longer required, can you imagine that? There'll be a lower level of demand. We anticipate that some of the behavioural changes that we've seen will stick. So not everyone will need to travel into the office anymore. All sorts of other trip types might fade away to a lesser or greater extent, less shopping trips, but others will come back fairly strongly as and when the lockdown is relaxed, school trips, education trips, that kind of thing. But there's also quite likely to be economic change, a recession, and an ongoing fear factor. So we would anticipate that the number of trips might be on the buses, say 85 to 90% of what they were pre-COVID, rather less on some of our rail modes. And that will have an ongoing impact in terms of the finances, of course. And indeed, it'll have an ongoing impact for London as a whole. The story of the last 30 years or so has been one of cities that have grown quite strongly, of agglomeration, of the benefits that brings to the knowledge economy. And it's not obvious that that will necessarily continue with such strength in the future, especially if public transport, which is the lifeblood of a lot of this, is hobbled with a less viable way of working in the future. Okay, hope that helps, and that's me.
Thank you, Jeff. Very interesting observations. Fourth, Alex Hornby. Alex is Chief Executive Officer of Transdev Blazefield. Just some people may not know, mainly operating in areas such as Lancashire, North and West Yorkshire, and Greater Manchester.
Thank you, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone. I will attempt to share my screen as well, and hope that works for you guys too. Are we on? Can everyone see that screen okay?
That's fine, yeah.
Great, okay. Okay, so I want to just sort of describe our sort of journey through all this, and I think we've tried to go through this journey as positively as we possibly can, whilst whilst we know that there's obviously huge waves against us, and whilst we've tried to struggle against a product that has been demonised, and hopefully the role of working in a bus company, working against that being potentially demonised as well. So in terms of dealing with the here and now, the one thing we've been very careful to do, we knew that if we were going to get through this, we had to get our people on board quite severely. We've been over communicating, intensive communication and very human communication right throughout this, in terms of weekly newsletters to our colleagues, a monthly magazine posted to everyone's house, because of course lots of people are furloughed and not in the business, and we're trying to keep them in touch. And as well, we've also embraced new things to engage our people, including a weekly YouTube video from myself and the directors, and a WhatsApp group with every depot now having direct contact with me and the rest of the director team, and us checking that on a daily basis. This is alongside a range of external communications in terms of regular timetable updates and all the things that everyone else in the industry has been doing. But if you think about how we used to plan our networks and plan service changes, and how we try and spread it out inside big organizations to essentially go through 7 schedule changes across 500 buses in the space of the time you would normally do that over sort of 3 years, it has been quite a challenge for the industry. I think in terms of how then we've made sure we've embraced, I think, the newfound celebrity of bus and bus workers, and we've been keen to embrace the work in our local communities. We've got our buses for heroes. We've got a bus in each of our areas now, decorated with images of all those who have helping us, helping our communities through the pandemic. And again, trying to get some positivity and making the best use of the situation we find ourselves in. And we find the elevated role that the bus has had in terms of transporting key workers, and our colleagues now being celebrated as key workers in the communities that we're in. How we recover, and I think was a point Jonathan made about how we communicate cleanliness, which is now the #1. I think it is fair to say that's now the #1 demand of our customers. We've surveyed over 700 of our customers since the start of April. Cleanliness is their #1 concern in terms of use the bus. It's the first time I think punctuality has ever been overtaken, but as we all know, punctuality isn't an issue at the moment because we have congestion-free streets, and we've been very keen as to how we communicate that under a strong banner campaign of being clean. We started 3 weeks ago, and it was very much against the grain when many other organisations were still peddling, trying to peddle against the Prime Minister's message of not using the bus. I think 2 days later we switched to this as an attempt to try and encourage people back to the bus, but doing so on clean buses and in a safe way. And this was the communication we shared, and you'll need your, hopefully you'll get this fine. Okay, right. Okay, and I think so. So generally, the way that we are now approaching things were to do what Churchill says. We're oh, sorry, sorry, technical fault. Okay, right. Yeah, we've sort of embraced our inner Churchill, and we've decided that, you know, our approach is we're not going to let a good crisis go to waste. So, you know, our communication has tried to be on brand. It's tried to be positive. It's trying to be encouraging people back. And whilst we are trying to inform people and getting them to perhaps change their behaviour to how they did used to use the bus before, we're doing it in a different, in an upbeat way. And I think we're still very keen. We've invested millions over the years to try and make buses places that people want to be seen. And what we don't want to do is let this be a diversion away from it, but still create an environment that people want to and look forward to come back to. The research that we've done with our customers has said that 90% of our customers will come back. We've done that across 700 people. I know that's different to some of the feedback we're getting elsewhere, but we, you know, as ever, we've got no reason to disbelieve our customers. I guess the thing that we want to understand more is when will they come back, and what that means in terms of how regularly they will travel when they come back. But the things they want to see is complete reassurance on cleanliness and safety. We've supplemented the communication that you saw in terms of the video and how that is all that's shared across all forms of media, with a sequel that shows a customer using a bus with the various things that they will encounter along the way. And again, we've done that in an upbeat banner that shows that the bus is still quite normal, our people are still quite normal, and they're still keen to look after you. And we've continued to celebrate the role of bus drivers, and I think we're keen that that becomes a positive legacy from where we are now, that drivers are now seen as even prouder members of their community from where they were. And similar to, as James has described, I think one positive legacy is cleaning, and how cleaning, I think we've long felt cleaning is a quality investment in your product, and it should be seen as investment and not a cost. Technology is another one in terms of how we have now done things that we've always wanted to do. We can now show customers on an app how many people are traveling, so they can plan their journeys better. And on the app as well, we're also showing you last time the bus was cleaned, a bit like what you find when you go to a motorway service station in terms of telling you when it was last cleaned to try and reassure you. We're doing that now on an app, so you can see when the bus was last cleaned, as well as all the live travel information. And the ability to buy tickets on your mobile, so you're not interacting with cash and so on with the driver. So to quickly, while I've got a minute left or so, what of the future? I think a lot of it, I actually find myself nodding along to what Jonathan was saying in terms of, I think buses, it's very important we're integrated into the active travel conversation. I think there was a fear, there is a fear that we're not and we won't be, but I think again we're finding that's different from area to area. I think we have the ability to benefit and bring benefits in terms of congestion-free streets, improved air quality, and taking benefits for the improved urban environments and destinations that we want to serve. And I think how we've all behaved, how the deregulated bus sector has behaved in all this, it's behaved with a hell of a amount of trust in terms of how the funding levels will work and how long the funding levels will last. And in return, you know, we have carried on. We've carried on providing oversupplying the network in order to deliver that. And I think we've provided value for money considering the specification that's been given. And all throughout this process, with the 7 local authorities certainly we've dealt with the networks that we've proposed, we've had no objections. And I think it has found a true bringing of people together, as James has said, bringing people together inside our organisation. But we've seen a lot more of bringing all the different stakeholders that we have. It has brought us together to move at pace and deliver quickly for those who need us. I think in terms of beyond that, in terms of new structures, I think there will be more of an open mind in the industry as to how things would work. I can see more operators and local authorities sitting around the table at social distance to design networks together and to work together with the funding they've got. and hopefully that will make best use of the innovation and entrepreneurship that the private sector can bring, and the powers and the knowledge and the responsibility that our local authority partners will bring. So I think we are approaching this with a glass half full. We know that it's going to be expensive getting through it, and it's going to be a challenge, but we think that once the thorny issue of social distancing is overcome, that the bus has got to be a really strong tool for us to move forward with. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Alex. I think most of the viewers today would rather sit on one of your buses than sit in my house, having seen your video of how clean your buses are. Penultimate speaker, David Sidebottom, Passenger Director of Transport Focus. You're going to give us a passenger's view.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And again, when you're fourth on a panel of speakers who have spoken so well about not just the customer experience and what they're doing to reassure passengers, but also again the policy side and the funding side. The challenge ahead is there's not much I can add really, but Transport Focus, traditionally I'll be here talking about levels of passenger satisfaction. We're talking about what builds trust in a product in the industry and what's the passengers' priorities for improvement. And the nod for the future would be, what do we do to encourage young people to stay on the bus and use the bus more in the future? And it's interesting that back in March we published our annual bus passenger survey with a very much a low-key fanfare, and that was deliberate. We didn't want to go out and talk about a set of results we captured last autumn, even though they were very positive for the industry. Satisfaction ranging from about 76% in the sort of lower end of the scale up to 95% in the higher areas. I think it's there as a benchmark for the future, and I think I'll probably come back to that at the end of my few minutes. What we've done in the meantime, though, I think just to try and during the pandemic, is understand those anxieties of people who are returning to public transport. Yes, there were very small numbers of people in relative terms continuing to use bus, rail and tram, particularly during the early days of all this. We've tried to track that through the course of the last few weeks, and every week we produce an omnibus survey which asks 2,000 people across Great Britain what it is that is causing them concern, what are the things they want to see change before they come back to using transport in any great numbers. And some of the things that are in there, and I won't put any slides up, but I'll happily share all this stuff with those who have not seen this work. There are challenges ahead, there are challenges now, and I think it reflects where people were and are. And I don't know about anybody else on this webinar, but I was quite worried, quite frightened about all this in the early days, and I think that spills into other things that you do. And I remember the first time I went to a supermarket, because I felt inexperienced. I felt like a novice again for the first time. The way I best describe that is, what can I expect and what's expected of me? And I think the way we see some of the supermarkets respond back in the day about you'll queue outside, you'll have hand sanitizers here, and here's what the staff will do, just helps build reassurance and confidence. And that very much touches upon the excellent stuff you've seen from Alex and James about what they're doing. Other operators are doing the same. But equally, and I'll be very blunt about this, I've seen some images of trains and buses. It looks like a crime scene on some of the vehicles. There's lots of orange and yellow and black tape. It's not very welcoming. And I know that's not a criticism, it's just a fact. And how do we build that encouragement and reassurance for people as they return to transport? Some of the things that we're seeing from our omnibus survey, some of the challenges ahead really, around about half of people are saying that they will work from home more in the future. Some people are saying that they won't be returning, they don't think, to their office environment for some weeks or months yet. Other people are talking about using the car more. And again, there's probably no surprise you're seeing this from other research that's out there. Cycling and walking, of course, are very popular at the moment. It'll be interesting to see now as the weather's changed. I'm sat here in sunny Stockport at the moment, but it's not been like that for the last couple of days, and it's interesting to see how many fewer people are actually walking and cycling at the moment. So again, there are challenges ahead. Jonathan's absolutely right. How do we get that road space right? The challenge now is, yes, there will be more people using the car. Now you balance that cycling, walking, and making sure that bus plays an increasingly active part in getting people back to the things that they want to do, going to work, going to places of education, going back to places of leisure and other important appointments. I think the bit of the car that was interesting in this, that it's never really gone away and it's not going to go away. And I think certainly what we're seeing from our work is that around 40% of people are saying that they will use the car more. We've got to accommodate that because perhaps that's people's choice. We've got to work out that road space. The technology stuff that we've seen from James and from Alex particularly about the ability to get better information to people so that they're more confident about bus as it's approaching, how many seats are free, the disabled access space on a bus, the wheelchair space, should I say, sorry. That's very important for people who perhaps have less choice. And we shouldn't forget in all this, as all our work has ever shown us, is that around every year we speak to 40, 50,000 bus passengers, and around about 45 to 50% of those people say that for the journey that they're just telling us about, rating their experiences, they had no easy alternative to using bus, to other forms of transport than using the bus. And that's nothing to do with the social stigma that, you know, sadly bus has been labelled with. It's a fact. People do rely on the bus, and how do we manage some way of finding that capacity for them as they start to come back to places of work and leisure. And I think this is the interesting bit. It's been touched upon by all the speakers. We've got a couple of really key dates coming up pretty soon, the 15th of June, the 4th of July, the dates. How soon will we reach capacity on all public transport, not just bus, on tram and on train? And even if we do start to see some relaxation of social distancing, I'm hearing that capacity won't increase incrementally. So how do we do that? Will we get to an all reservation type public transport system in the short to medium term? Technology could help with some of that, but equally there seems to be some insurmountable barriers to all that stuff. So I think the bit about reassurance in the short, medium term, I'm encouraged by everything that I'm picking up from the sector, but we have got finite capacity. And the longer term issue, I think, and everyone's touched upon it, is money. I've been on a call this morning with Network Rail, and I won't be speaking too much out of turn, but someone talked about the paranoia in Treasury. You've got half of Treasury who is keen to invest in infrastructure and do the right thing. You've got the other half of Treasury which is saying, we've got no money. How do we square all that off as a nation? There's some big questions in there, some big challenges, but I hope that's been helpful, and happy to chip in during the rest of the conversation about the passenger experience.
It has been very helpful, David. Thank you. Final presentation, Kathy Knight. Kathy is Commercial Sector Service Development Manager at North Yorkshire County Council. Over to you, Kathy.
Hello everyone. David, if you think you'd got some problems being speaker 5 of 6 and added anything new, you can imagine the challenge for me. Coupled with the fact I was invited yesterday, so I'll try and give you some insights from a county or operative perspective, and omitting some of the comments that have already been made by the other speakers. In North Yorkshire, patronage dropped to a low of 7% of pre-COVID levels. Having just received some figures, that has now risen to 12% of pre-COVID levels. We've had quite a focus on home to school and SEN transport as an operative authority. I'm not sure we've got all the answers on that one yet, particularly coupled with social distancing, as James alluded to on the vehicles during his presentation. As local authority officers, I'm aware colleagues across ATCO land have also had challenges internally. Why should we be paying those local bus service operators and coach operators for contracts that they're not providing? Why on earth should we be paying them for ENCTS payments at pre-COVID levels? Pointing them in the direction of DFT letters doesn't always help either, but I think most of us have got there, and I congratulate all of my local authority colleagues who've had that challenge and have overcome that challenge. We're also trying to work on social distancing at bus stops and bus stations and park and ride sites. That goes on in partnership with the operators in our area. I share the concerns already expressed about reallocating road space, and have concerns about the impact of bus journey times that will have. We also face challenges from competing services, competing local authority services, where district council colleagues wish to close roads to promote their street markets and food markets, without any thought to the impact that that will have, shutting the village off and not allowing bus services to get through. So we have challenges around that one as well. Looking to the future, we're obviously concerned about patronage levels and how that will affect the commercial viability of services and the pressure on supported bus service budgets. We have uncertainty around what our budgets will be next year and moving forward, together with uncertainty from DfT funding that local authorities might receive. In North Yorkshire, the pandemic has caused an additional £65 million worth of costs to the authority across all areas of services, yet we've received 25 million in funding, government funding, to deal with those additional costs. So we've got a shortfall there, aside from any other savings that we needed to deal with. And again, looking to the future in Yorkshire, in North Yorkshire, the preferred way is partnership to work with our local bus service operators. So we'll be doing that going forward. I share David's point about young people as well, and I think ensuring they return to public transport is going to be key as part of that partnership work with our local operators. I hope that's some help to everyone.
It has indeed, Kathy. Thank you ever so much. Thanks to all the speakers there. We're now going to open up just to a general discussion. I think the kind of best way to perhaps structure this is really that there's clearly a lot of short-term issues facing the sector. So maybe we can kind of concentrate on them to start with. And then moving on to kind of perhaps more medium-term things of whether there's any kind of changes to restrictions, lockdown, or social distancing that could help the sector, or messaging from government. And then we'll finish with the kind of longer-term issues, perhaps regulatory issues and funding issues. So if that's a useful way to structure it. In terms of there's been a lot of points on the chat coming through. Themes which are kind of on the short-term kind of side of things. There's been a lot of discussion about the cleaning regimes, including suggestions as to whether this is, how do we know that it's actually effective in reducing the virus, or is it more important to be communicating it as a message to the public that our vehicles are being kept very clean? Is there any, Alex, did you have any comment on that? Do you know that your cleaning regime is going to reduce transmission, or is it more a presentational thing for the public?
I think I think it's all about presentation. I think if customers are telling us that's their number one concern, we have to act on it. And I think, from where we are, we're building this into our ongoing plan going forward. That if we've now heightened this, customers are reacting, positively to it, the few that are coming back. But, we are seeing some shines of light. We are seeing people very publicly saying to us, I've got one here that someone commented directly to me today, where they are saying, this wasn't as bad as what I've been told, and I'm actually quite pleased to be on the bus today. And so I'm on the airline for the first time since March. Great announcements, user-friendly posters. I've known what to do. Passengers have been very respectful. Great job by you. And that was to our team in Keighley. So I think I think some of this stuff works. I think it's going to work in small numbers, but I think for now it's all about presentation and giving the impression that buses are clean and safe.
Okay. Does the requirement to wear masks? Well, one person was asking whether that will affect in terms of social distancing on buses. Would it allow you to reduce the distance between passengers? And maybe someone else might want to chip in if Alex, anyone have a view on that? James,
So
are you coming in on that? James?
Yes,
yeah.
if I may, Andrew. I mean, it's quite interesting. We've been thinking to ourselves, well, perhaps a meter would make a difference. So let's just measure that out. And we found that it added 1 passenger to our 20 on a double decker. So that's a waste of time. I think the issue is, I mean, I continue to hear contradictory advice from different specialists about, are masks a good thing or aren't they? They're obviously a good reassurance, and a lot of this, Alex is right, it's about giving people the confidence. I thought David made a really interesting point in his presentation about the fact that the world's all turned upside down, and you don't really feel confident in yourself anymore as a user. You don't know how to kind of work your way through all this. And so so I think a lot of what we're doing is about reassuring people. So if masks reassure people and make them feel more confident, that's a good thing. But I haven't heard anyone say yet, but perhaps they will. And as Jonathan said, you know, today's poison is tomorrow's meat and drink. So you know, somebody may say, well, with masks it's okay, you just sit in next to each other, that'll be fine. It's when they do that that we can really get moving. While we're still messing around with one person on between 6 seats, we're just not in the real world.
Okay, so that message have to come from government rather than from operators. What about redesigning buses? There's been some suggestions, some people raising questions about whether the bus could be actually redesigned for social distancing. There was even a suggestion of kind of shower curtains behind each set of seats. Is that what do people think? Any ideas on whether buses can be redesigned for a socially distancing culture? I don't see many takers on that. Jeff, were you about to say something there?
Well, there's a de facto redesign in the sense that we tried middle door boarding in London, but it comes with some severe downsides, like, well, no fares revenue, and selfishly from my perspective in the planning department, no data about where the hotspots are and where the demand is and isn't. And indeed, the redesign that we've taken forward is to insulate the driver's cab much more effectively than ever before, and that ought to be a way of making the bus safe for the driver. Then for the passenger, the question previously was, will masks change social distancing rules? Well, there's only one bunch that matter in this, and that's Public Health England. As long as they say 2 meters, then it's 2 meters, and that means 20 people per double deck, and that's what we follow, like it or lump it. So I think any other redesign, certainly in London for a fleet of 9,000, is going to be a bit of a long shot. And in the meantime, I think a vaccine would turn up sooner than a redesign of the fleet.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Road space reallocation is another area of discussion on the chat site. What was striking from the government's letter to local authorities was that they were specifically saying that the funding should be local authorities should target the funding at corridors, at busy public transport corridors, particularly those corridors where public transport journeys are short. So one would take that to mean bus corridors. And they want cycling, investment in cycle lanes in these corridors. You know, I think the government's hope would be that does deliver some long-term travel behaviour change as well as just short-term change. What's what's people's experiences of the temporary road space reallocation measures? Are buses being protected in these, or are there difficulties? Are local authorities coming forward with projects which really aren't in the interests of the bus? Anyone want to come in on that?
Shall I say a few words?
Yeah.
So in some cases, it's really very necessary indeed. So Brixton town centre is a very busy part of the world. There's lots of interchange. There's a lot of use of buses, even with demand well down. There's a lot of shops. And so the road space reallocation there is really an effort to try and ensure social distancing in and around the series of bus stops in that neck of the woods. And yes, it's required some longer walks from the shops and the station, but it's in that particular instance, public health, it rightly takes precedence. In some other cases, there's a City of London scheme that's emerging at the moment that will be quite, to use the overused word, transformational. And there, it's more about being car-free than pedestrianisation. And again, that could be really fairly beneficial from our perspective, from the selfish perspective of the buses. But there are always trade-offs to be had, and there are lots of schemes which are less beneficial. But on the whole, so far, we've been trying to make the very most of this, take this as an opportunity, and that's been successful.
Okay. maybe if I can reword the question and get some other contributions on this from outside London, where are the bus operators being engaged in the decisions on road space reallocation by councils?
Do you want a reflection, Andrew?
Yeah, you come in, John. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's proving what we already know, that it's so variable in terms of local areas and the strength of the partnership. So I was part of a conversation in one major English city where it could not have been more collaborative and looking at how not just walking, cycling, but also bus could benefit, and thinking ahead about locking in beyond COVID. So, brilliant two-way discussion. But there's another city in mind, which actually is not in England, I'll stop at that point, where our major bus corridor, along which virtually every single bus in the city runs, has just been severed, with buses diverted off to back streets. And actually the irony is that the pavements that are now unusable for bus are actually quite socially distanced, and our bus passengers are being sent to very pokey pavements. Nil collaboration. I could have guessed which authority would do what
beforehand. Really,
yeah.
You can see. Okay, and is that just because are the authority, do they just not engage with the operator? There's been a history of not engaging with the operator. Is that the problem?
Yes, and I think it's a history of not engaging with operator and taking very short-termist actions without really a strategy being present.
I wonder if there's anyone from the authority here. They're certainly not admitting it.
There's not.
Anyone else got observations on this? Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks. I think, we were a bit surprised by the letter, the tone of it around road space reallocation. I think DFT were too, and I think it's part of a wider picture of the way the government's handling the crisis, which isn't always completely joined up between departments, and also occasionally you get these sporadic surprise diktats, one of which we experienced yesterday. However, we, at least in our areas, the money's been routed to the combined authority rather than the districts, which we hope will end up with some more balanced outcomes. And I have been talking to Graham Bidler at CBT around, we want to ensure that we can strike the right balance here in the bus, and bus users aren't penalised. I've also been talking to Sustrans about whether some of the active travel NGOs are at the moment in a state of complete ecstasy about what's going on, but whether they can also show a bit of solidarity with public transport and the bus. So we'll see where we get to with that, but perhaps there's some kind of rough common wording or common approach that could be adopted across various interests around this to steer us through. But certainly, if there are problems in our areas, then it will be useful to know in advance if that's cropping up.
Oh, interesting. You seem to be suggesting, Jonathan, that letter from the DFT didn't originate in the DFT.
Well, I think it certainly went through a further iteration when it went through Downing Street.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just going to have to go now because I've got to go to the meeting. But
thank you very much.
Good discussion.
Thanks very much for your participation. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Okay. Just seeing anyone else who wanted to come in on that. Look, let's go to a question that I'm just looking for. I've got so many sheets of paper in front of me, which is a little bit confusing. But yeah. Let's go to a question that Steve Gooding put. Steve, do you want me to ask it? You put it on email, but if you want to ask it yourself, feel free.
Okay, thank you. I put a version of it into the chat zone there, but I mean, the thing that worries me in this context is, even with all of the brilliant ideas that I've seen this afternoon, so many of the conversations I've heard in the last 5 or 6 weeks assume things will spring back, And yet I keep seeing scientific confusion over things like social distancing and the like. It just strikes me, in addition to thinking, well, as someone has just said, let's assume social distancing is relaxed and goes. What's a new normal look like? I'd be tempted to put together 2 or 3 scenarios, of which, no, it's not my car and chauffeur, it's a backdrop of the Royal Automobile Club foyer, which I'm very much missing, I can assure you. You don't want to see my living room. Are we really thinking, what if, when we're thinking particularly, what if, even if the scientific evidence, many people have commented on it, the scientific evidence says you're getting a bit over yourselves on 2 meter distancing, but what if we still got 1.5 meter distancing or even 1 meter for 12 to 18 months? What if a third of the companies who found that their staff can work from home decide, okay, that's a great idea, let's carry on with that. Change the whole concept of the town and city centre, and with the ripple out effect that will have for all of the other businesses that depend on those jobs. Plus, we're just going into a recession. We just are. In that environment, what would we do? Because I tend to think, those of you who know me well, I'm looking at John Dowie here, will know, if you think about the worst case, and what you might do there, then everything above that is bunts. So what do people think about that worst case? How likely is it? Do we think we might still be there in 12 months? And if we were, how could we turn that to our advantage? I'd say one more thing, which wasn't in the question originally, but which is, because I think one more positive thing that might just come out of this is a realization that we aren't going to get the mass transit services that we would aspire to unless nationally we're prepared to subsidize them. And to look at, well, what could we do in a group that's taking part in a conversation like this today, to look at why is it that we see different patterns of transport in places. We've recently in the foundation been looking at Munich. There's a whole bunch of reasons why things are different, and one of them is they're willing to pay for it. Not pay through the fare box, but they're willing to pay for something that's a different proposition. And it all comes back to a different lifestyle that people want. And actually, having had a deep look at Munich, I think I'd quite like to live there. So, sorry, long point there, Andrew, but how bad could it get? Can we think about that? And what other evidence can we put on the table about how different it could look like?
Okay. There's a few issues there that I would think some people will have want to express views on. I'm just looking, if anyone's on the second screen or third screen, actually they don't seem to have photos on videos of them, so I can't see any hands up or anything like that. But does someone want to respond to really Steve Gooding's points there about if this is a long, I think the assumption was that this may be over in kind of 3 to 6 months time, but really this could go on for much longer, and what are the implications? Yeah, I see a hand raised down at the bottom. Nick, over to you, Nick.
I think I really welcome Steve Gooding's thoughts and ideas. I think it's just spot on. We've got to start thinking like this. In my humble opinion, bus deregulation was bad for bus operators and bad for people wanting to make journeys, and bad for everyone. It's delivered nothing good that I can see. So the sooner we get back to the idea of paying for things that bring social and economic benefits and improve air quality, the better. I agree with Steve that I think social distancing will be around for quite a long while. The British public have been scared witless, completely unreasonably actually. There's mounting evidence that this virus is pretty selective for small quantities of people in how badly it affects them. But actually for the vast majority, it is survivable and we can get on with our lives. But that's not the current agony amongst the British public, who are terrified of it. And so long as they remain terrified, it will be jolly hard to get people back onto public transport. But over time, it'll happen. But by that time, we may not have any money left.
We
Andrew,
can't
you need
hear
to
you,
mute
Andrew.
yourself.
You're on mute, Andrew.
Sorry, I was sorry about that. Yeah, I was just reminded by comment in Roger Davis, who's an ex-bus manager in LTT, wrote the Viewpoint. Similar point to Steve. His line was public transport and social distancing don't mix. End of. You know, nothing more to say on that. But look, let's go to John Carr. John. Now you're doing what I did. You're on mute.
Have you got me now? Right, I think, picking up the last couple of contributions, I think it's well worthwhile looking at what has gone on abroad. Munich is a nice example. I agree with Steve. I wouldn't mind living there either. But if we look further afield than that, Hong Kong, which has had experience of 2 previous pandemics, or epidemics, I suppose they were technically, has lost only 40% of patronage in this outbreak, and phenomenally, only 4 deaths attributed to COVID. Mark Sabelli, who some of you will know, tells me that one of the factors there is that the operators have introduced extra deep cleaning measures, but also that 99% of passengers are naturally accustomed to wearing a mask when they're outside. Now, whether that's a confidence factor or whether it is an actual effect, I don't think anybody really knows. But there is experience from other places like New Zealand and Japan, which seems to be similar. But as has been said, we've got the social distancing with us now. I think we've got to react to that by doing a degree of bus redesign, which incidentally will not be a bad thing because many seats on buses at the moment are not designed for the typical person that will use them. They belong to an earlier age in a sense. The other thing that comes to me in all this is that Nick just said nothing good came out of bus deregulation. I think what did come out of bus deregulation that was good was that managers that were already by and large in the industry had their imaginations released and could run services that were better tailored to what the public wanted. Now, people say, well, we could alter all that by regulation. I don't think now it matters because we're in an emergency situation whereby, and I think people like Ben Colson will agree with me, we're going to see a publicly supported bus industry if the government sticks to decarbonisation plans for quite some time to come. And hopefully that will be based on partnership whereby not only the bus operators, but other traffic that's essential in cities to maintain the life of the cities is sitting there with the local highway authority and are saying this is how we can maximise the use of the resources we've got available.
Do you want to just highlight, John, just before you go, do you want to highlight your work you've done with CILT as well?
Yes, I'll give that plug. CILT released earlier this week a white paper which can be found on the website, and I'll circulate afterwards so that you can put it in the magazine, the link to it, where we've really tried to put out a route map, as it were, for how we tackle the short term and how we move from there back to the decarbonisation agenda, which the government was promoting as recently as the beginning of March.
Okay, good. So people will be able to find that. That's great. Roger French messaged me just to give perhaps an optimistic piece of a line, which that really Roger's suggesting that young people will perhaps revert back to using public transport more quickly. They're maybe less inhibited by the kind of COVID-19 fears. I think I've lost you on the text thing, but I think that's kind of roughly right, Roger. The message you were giving. Do you want to just add anything on that?
Well, it comes through in Transport Focus's weekly surveys. A third of respondents
in the 18 to 24 age group. So I'm not talking teenagers, I'm talking young adults who are key to the future. They're saying they haven't got so many fears about using public transport as older people. And also it's interesting, in those same surveys, a third of people in London don't have the fears either. And I predict that this will drive the future. I mean, I don't want to get political, but it's quite clear the government aren't following the science. The government are following public opinion here, and what the public are doing, they have throughout what's been going on here. And the only reason Grant Shapps announced face coverings yesterday was because, as he said in his speech, they accept that on public transport, 2 meters social distancing is not practical, which it clearly isn't on a London Underground train going through Victoria or wherever. And I think that will lead to more people getting more confidence with face coverings. I mean, when schools go back in September, and at some point they're going to have to go back, our children are going to need to be educated. How on earth do people think you're going to get kids to school with a solo with 7 seats on it, or 20 on a double decker? It is just not going to happen. And so there will have to be compromises made on social distancing. So, and the point about redesigning buses, well, that's all very well, but in the rural area, a lot of buses used on school buses are then used to make them economically sound on public services. So you can't have buses kitted out for about half a dozen people and then expect 80 kids to get on them. I think we've got to get a bit practical here.
Beneath you on the screen, Robin Poynton. Robin, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. This question, just going back to Alex, your presentation. You mentioned there about the approach you're taking, which, as I say, is very positive in the light of the outbreak. Are you able to share any sort of information regarding what patronage levels are like at the minute? I know we've typically seen across the industry down to sort of 10% levels. Is it any different for yourselves at Transdev?
So we threw a party the other day because we were 23% of our normal levels, which was a shocking 5% movement. And to be fair, now that the rain's arrived, it's gone back down to around 19% of normal levels. And to be fair, I'm not suggesting it's because of anything we've done. I think there's very different attitudes area to area. In the swathe of the north that we serve, when the Prime Minister said don't use buses, usage shot up in Blackburn by 5% compared to the week before, whereas in Harrogate it stayed the same. So I think, I think my view is, again, I'd rather be doing the positive things, and I'd rather be getting the positive message out in the hope that it is hitting. It's what the customers are saying they want to see that will reassure them. I think if you've got advocates that are keen to use your bus services, and you've got people who haven't got a choice, then hopefully the use should go quicker. I really enjoyed listening to the point about what Roger said about young people, and I think when schools do return, that the point I made in the chat room is that may quickly reclimatise young people's attitudes to buses, because they will be forced to use them again, and I think that may soon change their attitudes. And then when they go home and hopefully tell their parents it was all okay, you never know, that may be an attitude swing that we could all benefit from.
Does the fact that universities may not have intakes next year or studying in the university towns, is that a big concern for operators? James, nodding your head.
Yeah, so it's very significant, but it's a bit of luck as well, because if we've got social distancing, we've neither buses nor drivers to move them.
Right. Okay. I saw someone's hand go up, actually.
Yeah, it's me, actually, Andrew. Could I come in, please, on the young people issue? I think we're at risk of conflating two separate things here. One is kids going to school, and the other is young adults making travel decisions of their own choice. If you look at the Bank of England predictions and the OBR predictions, most of the job losses, and the OBR is predicting almost exactly 2 million job losses from 1.28 to 3.2 million. Most of those will come from part-time jobs and the types of jobs that young people have. Now, if they haven't got the money in their pockets, and they haven't got a purpose to go to work, leaving aside any other social consequences, I think we're at risk of overplaying the young people, young adults' travel of choice potential to draw us back. As far as kids going to school is concerned, I agree entirely with Roger. Although I also would make the point that I'm with John entirely on seat distancing on buses. And I can travel on a London bus. I can't travel on buses anywhere else in the country if they're of a standard design. If they're of a premium design, yes, I can. I'm 6'3", you know, I'm not that specially and tall, but I can't fit into them. And therefore, I see this as actually a marketing opportunity to actually make a bus that's fit for the current generation, fit for the current era, and using that as part of the way we get into getting people on. So we don't cram them in the same way, but we don't go to the 2 meter rule, because I don't think the 2 meters will last. I think personally, I think the face mask wearing, which was announced yesterday, is just a prelude to dropping the 2 meter down to whatever it might be, 1.5, whatever it might be. And school transport issues will be a particular subset of the issue. But I think we need to be a bit cautious about assuming young adults with money in their pockets will carry on as they have, because not me, it's Bank of England, it's OBR, all suggesting they're the ones who are going to lose most jobs.
Can I raise or bring in the kind of economic dimension of bus operations now, and which is perhaps looking a little bit at the long-term structure of the industry? Neil Chadwick, are you still around, Neil? You put in a text at 3 o'clock. Are you still?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Great. Do you want to just go over your point about the consensus seems to be that the new normal?
Yeah, the consensus seems to be that new normal is going to be less demand than we had pre-COVID, and no doubt all of the cleaning and hygiene that Alex has talked about is going to push up costs. So that's going to suggest that we're going to have a network adjustment downward, is it not? And that's in the best case scenario.
Okay. Anyone want to? James, you did nod your head slightly there. Do you want to say anything?
Well, I think that seems entirely right. I mean, this whole issue is about how much is anyone prepared to pay for how long to keep the current network going, and it's a very interesting question. And I mean, you know, we've had our minds concentrated now because in order to make best use of our available buses and more importantly drivers, we've had to concentrate our efforts where the people are and where the immediate requirement to move people is. But that also, ironically, lines up with where the best routes are. So there are bits of my network that haven't seen a bus since March. And actually, I'm not at all sure that I know how they're ever going to see another bus until somebody comes up with a new idea. So
are these areas which were commercially operated, or were these tendered?
These are areas which are very marginal commercial. In other words, we were just able to run them, or questionably able to run them, but they don't have very many passengers. The people who use them, as is always the way with these things, you know, for them it's really important. But in terms of the mass market, we are simply being driven to run where people need us most. But that's defining the network, and the network already looks smaller. It's very interesting to think, and then people are starting to say to me, in the city of Bath, for example, some of our smaller routes, they're saying, is this route ever going to come back? And I look them in the eye and say, well, it all depends.
And just on that, have we got a problem here where the tendered services on the kind of, have we got a situation where the very commercial routes are okay, the tendered routes are still being provided, but there's this middle ground of commercial but not very profitable, or are the tendered services also not being provided at the moment?
I think, Andrew, I mean, one thing that certainly we're already working through with one of our authorities is that they are saying, and it takes up James's point about routes that have disappeared and haven't come back yet. It's whether they come back at all, and it's now working together with authorities almost to decide where that is, and then saying to us which one of, you know, what of your commercial routes we're risking to be dropped off, that we'll then have to put the funding onto there. But actually, it's quite a grown-up conversation with this particular authority, and I think that's where I think the mind shift is changing a bit, because everyone's coming to the table and saying, well, what is the right bus network then? And we're working together to deliver that.
Interesting. Does anyone want to come in on those points? Because they seem pretty fundamental to me. Yeah, John Carr and maybe then Peter Hedegaard. Do John Carr first. Oh, you're on mute still, John. You're still on mute.
Yeah, there now. I think what John Bickerton's just said on the chat, that we're moving from the purely commercial or purely subsidized view to saying what is the value of these routes to the community. You know, we've been discussing schools, we've been discussing young workers, the likelihood that many of them are going to suffer the worst economic consequences. But my view would be that for several years, the government is actually going to have to make a decision as to how much it wants to put into the bus industry. And it's the bus industry's job, together with the local authorities, to say, how can we best spend that money? That, I think, is something which has been said several times, can only be achieved by partnership, by working together. And I think it does require local allocation, not central allocation, once the government has given the general view as to what the national bus strategy is going to be.
Okay, thank you. Peter. Peter, sorry, you need to come off mute.
Yeah. Sorry, this values community, one other dimension that hasn't really come up so far is the question about demand management in cities like Oxford, whereby if you're talking about a more difficult environment as far as bus operation is concerned, there isn't any physical scope for increased car use, or at least if there's a pressure to maintain or even to increase the amount of car use, but there's not the physical, let alone the environmental opportunity to do it. So how do you sustain and attract? I think of something like the park and ride service, which is fundamental to the demand management of a city like Oxford, but which runs with 80-seater double-deckers at the moment. How do you sustain that as just one element of the overall public transport system in the kind of context that we've been talking about, both medium and longer term? Who pays to sustain that, and if not, what? And Oxford's not unique. It's a particularly profound case in this, but it's not unique. I mean, York is, presumably, would have a similar challenge.
Okay. Does anyone want to comment on that, about how the network is going to be paid for? I'm sorry, just in the back of my mind, I'm reminded that the 10 Greater Manchester districts are estimating that their losses due to COVID-19 in 2020-21 will be 406 million. And that's after the government funding, which has already been given. So, you know,
as it happens in Oxford, the park and ride service is currently operated commercially.
Right.
But it's nothing compared to what's being pumped in to keep trains travelling up and down tracks for the last few weeks. It's almost petty cash, Andrew, what's coming into the bus industry. And we mustn't forget it, that 3 or 4 times as more people used to travel by bus than train. And yet we don't seem to worry about keeping the trains running. I've been watching on the Brighton Main Line, I've been watching trains going by. There's 4 trains an hour. And you're lucky if you've got 4 people on them. It is just absolutely amazing what we have been prepared to do for the last 3 months. And yet already we're worrying about, is the money still going to be there for buses? But it seems funny to me.
A good point, and one which is often made about the rail industry being seen somewhat differently from the bus industry. A few nods going around at the moment. John, you're waving again. You want to come in on that?
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Roger's saying, that the net expenditure by local authorities outside London on the bus network, concessionary travel and everything included in that, and some things that aren't counted in government statistics, like the costs of special educational needs and adult social services, was around about 200 to 250 million. It's a drop in the ocean compared with what the government is currently putting out by bearing the entire cost of the rail network.
Does anyone know what the figure for the railways is at the moment? Anyone got any idea?
It's about 180 million a week.
Wow. Wow.
So 2 weeks of railways and a super bus network.
Incredible. Steve Hayes. Steve, do you want me to read your question out, or do you want to come in on it? Do you want to ask it? Hello, Steve.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, just unmuting. Yeah, I mean, it's a similar theme to what we've just been discussing, really. I mean, I think you know, worst case scenario that Steve Gooding described is probably the reality. You know, bus services aren't going to be commercially viable anywhere for probably at least a year or more to come. So I guess it's, you know, it's understanding where the, you know, commercial bus operators are happy to be reliant on large amounts of public subsidy for the next few years, or do we need to, you know, fundamentally look at the delivery model of how we transport people around our cities? Now, in reality, it's probably a blend of the two, but I'm just interested where that sort of balance lies in the autonomy that's given to the private sector just to get on with it in return for big amounts of money, or the extent to which they need to work collaboratively with the public sector, either through a contracted model or a partnership model, and whether the legislation that's currently in place is able to support that.
Does an operator want to come in on reflect on those points?
It's interesting, Andrew, that you see the state trading statements being made by the likes of First, Stagecoach, Go Ahead. It's interesting how they're talking up their contracted operations in London, Singapore, Dublin. You know, previously it was all about, hey, we're entrepreneurs here running deregulated markets, but all of a sudden, oh, no, we're only exposed a little bit to that. So there's definitely a tide turning with the PLCs. But it's interesting, I think Julian Peddle's now left us, so he was here earlier. In a meeting of bus operators over the last 2 or 3 weeks, he has observed, and I think it's true, that the middle tier operators, and Alex may be able to comment for Transdev, but those who have less of a demand for a higher margin, they haven't got hungry shareholders, actually they're not doing too bad at the moment with the level of subsidy that they're getting and the networks that they're performing. But I think in the medium term, the big problem is going to be the shareholders of the PLCs are going to start thinking, where is our profit margin going to come from?
Do you want to come in, Alex, or?
I think the only thing I will say is that I think my group, before the funding was announced, I think was quite horrified as to what might happen in the UK in terms of, you know, Blazefield is quite unique within the Transdev group. 99% of our operations are in franchised B2G environments. Yet this is one they are comfortable with because I think we perform a role for the group. And you know, we seem to make a decent job of it, so they're quite happy to have us in the family. But I think the thing that I think really struck a chord with Dan is how the government has responded in a way that they didn't expect, and in a way that actually even some B2G environments across the world, they are fighting for the funding and the long-term support there. So in some ways they are quite comforted, and I think they do see the glass half full in the way that Roger described how Julian saw it. You know, the demand on our margins is not the kind of levels that the shareholders of PLCs may expect. You know, we still have to obviously deliver return on investments and so on. But I think, you know, they feel quite comfortable in the UK, and I think they do see some opportunities from all this, because the quest for higher margins won't be there, but yeah, the margins they are comfortable with, maybe.
Okay. James, looked like you had something. Yep.
Well, I was just going to say that, I mean, it's inevitable, isn't it? The 1985 Act is dead. It's gone. And there's no point in worrying about it. It's out of the way. Somebody said earlier, well, could we manage to kind of organize ourselves with the powers that already exist? And I think the answer is, if you've got the right parties, it is possible to do that, because the know-how of the operators and the requirements of the local authorities put those two things together, and actually that's what we're doing at the moment. We're working in our area very close to the Western England Combined Authority, but most of the time we do what's obvious, because what else would you do? And I think that's the approach that we need to take. It all depends on where the money comes from. As long as the money keeps flowing, we can do whatever's needed. And you know, actually, from the point of view of PLC, a steady income is as attractive as a very high margin. You know, it's just a different way of skinning the cat. So I don't think it's impossible to see us just gradually shifting around the mulberry bush to a different location and still be able to work and still be able to do what we set out to do in the first place.
Would you, if you had an ask of the government or Grand Chaps, what would your ask be?
Not to give us 3 days notice of everything you want.
And longer term?
Well, a week would be better. I mean, I think at the moment nobody's really thinking longer term, are they? And to some extent, you can understand why, because until we've got our heads around, between us, all of us have got our heads around how this bloody COVID thing is going to play out. Actually, you know, you can waste a lot of time worrying about what's going to be happening in a year's time because we haven't got a clue. Nobody on this call can tell us what's going to be happening in a year's time, or nobody in the country. That's the real problem. That we're all feeling our way, whether we criticise the way the government's doing it or not. The fact of the matter is, there isn't an obvious, straightforward, that's the way to go, folks. Is there? Tell me different if you think it different.
Can I just bring in someone from Task Partnership, if they're still around, if they want to say anything? Matthew Mole. Matthew wrote an interesting blog, I think in quite early on the outset of COVID, which I think was a good read, and we put it in the magazine. About whether this might change the regulatory frameworks, etc. And I think he left it by saying that the big PLCs might quite welcome you know, handing over their operations to local authorities, but he then asked whether local authorities would actually want them anymore. But Matthew, just from the overall discussion, if you are there, have you got any reflections on what you've heard today?
I think I agree with James, really, that obviously we're still in a position where no one really knows what's going to happen. We get told there's a vaccine in 2 weeks and a vaccine in 2 years. So it's, you know, that long-term planning isn't there. But I think there is quite that positive message amongst operators that, you know, the willingness to work with local authorities. And I think that's kind of the short to medium really is, as long as the money keeps coming, is to keep providing the service and talking about, you know, where we put it, you know, and where, you know, where there needs to be more resources, how that's going to happen. And hopefully, you know, with some places seeing a take up in ridership, we'll start seeing services that are heading back towards the commercial viability. But obviously the big question then is, if the government wants this green recovery, is it going to fund the green buses itself? Because we found that with the electric bus town bid, the big problem, as was made public in Oxford, was that it's not the difference between the cost of a diesel vehicle and an electric vehicle, it's actually the cost of getting a new vehicle itself is now an issue.
Okay. Thank you, Matthew. Look, we've just come to, it's 25 to 4. We were going to bring it to close around 3:30, I think. And I think it's probably time to draw a few thoughts and to a close, and I'll hand back to Peter. You know, doing these, I'm always overwhelmed with all the information coming at me, and my mind processing isn't as good as it used to be. I don't know, getting old. But I thought it was excellent. Thank you for all the contributions. Lots of interesting stuff about what's being done in the short term. I get the impression that if the government funding continues for the time being, things the operators can deliver services, but we're clearly hearing that the landscape, when any new normal as a cliche is put, does come around, then the networks we're faced with maybe are likely to be very different in size and shape. And the big question, which is unanswered, is really what's going to happen on the funding and regulation of the bus industry in the medium to longer term. I think I'm going to leave it there. And Peter, you'll probably have more reflections to offer.
Hi, thanks a lot, Andrew, and thanks to all the panel. I think it's been incredibly rich in information and thoughts today. Can't sum it up myself either, but I would say the idea that money is doing the talking at the moment is clearly the case. I mean, or the lack of money, perhaps in some circumstances, doing the talking, as James has alluded to. What the government's expectation is and what the Treasury's expectation is about this pipeline of money. It's a bit like the furlough thing. I don't know, and I don't suppose anybody does, but it's probably inside the Treasury that we need to be looking rather than inside the Department for Transport. Is Steve Gooding still here? Or John Dowie? Because you know what things are like in government, guys. So I'm always interested to get a view on how you think these, or whether there is any real forward planning going on at the moment on this sort of thing in government.
I'm still here, Steve Gooding here. I can't see whether John is because my screen has changed picture. But I can't say for certain because I've been out of government for 5 years now, but my impression would be, my expectation would be, as someone described, I think it might have been Andrew right at the start, that there's a bunch of people in the Treasury who are being told, you've got to kickstart the economy and get this going again. By and large, they'll be thinking about how they can get some more roads built. There'll be a bunch of people in the Treasury going, I hope you're not committing us to spending any money because we don't have any. And then there'll be a bunch of people in another bit of the Treasury worrying about how is this economy actually going to work? Where are the jobs? How are we going to get people to jobs? How are we going to get companies to be flourishing such that they can employ them? What's going to have to be true to make that all work? They will be coming up with their own theories. To some extent, they'll be having conversations with people in DFT. I happen to know that the Transport Department has got a director of strategy. One of her roles, she's been given a bit of space, is to think beyond what most other people have been forced to think about recently, which is tomorrow, next week, and the rest of it, who knows? So there's definitely some thinking going on. What I would say is there is space for some thinking to be done. And what I would say is that the more that thinking can be informed by people saying, well, look, these are the realities. These are the realities of operation. These are realities of where you can actually run a mass transit service and where you can't. This is where we think things might work and where they might not. This is what cities might look like if we decide within, say, a mile, 2 miles, the centre of every city, we're just not going to have any motorised transport. That's definitely how some places are thinking. This is what the consequences are. The more that the thinking that goes on in Whitehall and in local authorities can be informed, the better. And a lot of the people on the call today have got a lot of information to share. And I'm just seeing someone's popped up there, Stephen Fiddler. He's a top bloke. You know, if there's an option, having a conversation with Stephen Fiddler about what you think and what you would like him to know, and what you would like him to have in his mind when he's advising ministers and others, then, you know, why not drop him a line and say, are you up for a chat?
We did have to intervene on that one. I don't know whether you know, Steve, that there's a group called the 10% Club of Bus Operators, which is Roger French is the secretary of, which has informal chats about issues. It's a bit easier to do it in that format than CPT or the big groups. And we did approach Stephen earlier before the pandemic kicked in about talking through the implications of the bus strategy, and they weren't very interested. Him and Catriona, I think it is the colleague who does buses. I think it's quite hard to get civil servants in post rather than after post like you to come out like this, and I can't see any downside to it. I really can't. If Stephen Fiddler was here today, or anybody of his level listening in and making the odd question themselves, it should be really helpful, but they don't want to come.
If I was going to offer something in Stephen and Katrina's defence, I can't say why they didn't want to have a chat.
No.
The lockdown happened. What I would say is, if I were back there now, well, if I were back doing my old job, they'd both be working for me. And if someone said, offered to have a chat with them and they said no, I'd be bloody cross. And I think particularly if an approach was made now, we think you guys are thinking about how we get the economy going again after this is tamed, whatever that might mean. And we've got some ideas we'd love to share with you. I'd be astonished if they didn't respond. But the other thing you always need to do in these circumstances is to think, well, make the approach to somebody next step up the line, a successor whose name momentarily escapes me, or think about dropping a line to the bus minister, who astonishingly, whose name also currently escapes me because I've just lost track of the ministers recently.
There'll be another one behind.
There always is.
John, wait a second. Roger, are you still here? Roger French.
Hello, Peter.
Should we have another go at Stephen Fiddler then?
Could do, yeah.
You sound a bit weary on it, and so am I. I don't know how we'll get there. I would say to you, Steve, that we did find that Tricia Hayes, for a period of time, really did reach out, and she's gone now to the Home Office. So I'm not. I haven't got a contact that I would go in a warm.
If you want to tell me, if you guys would like to tell me what it is you want to bring to the table for a conversation with Stephen, I'm in touch with him, so I can suggest to him that it might be worth his while. Chances are, let's be honest, he's had 1 week off, and he's one of the guys who's almost certainly being deputed to do other things and not think about his day job for most of the last 10 weeks. So I'll be putting it to him as you are wrenching yourself back to think about day job, one of the things you might like to do is this. I'm happy to do that if you'd like me to help.
Okay, thank you. I'm just sort of forming in my head another session we could have in a few weeks' time on not on one particular policy area, but on general futurology for people in positions of influence. That would be a good session, I think. To grab some straws in.
I'll definitely vote for that.
Yeah. Okay. I might do a plug here, by the way. Steve, you're booked for next time in 2 weeks' time with me. We're going to have a session for everybody still here wants to put it in their diary. We're going to have a session on the future of car travel and what the pandemic message is to both the consumer side of car use, the drivers and motorists, and also the automotive industry and how it's changing in response to what it's learned in the last 3 months. So I'm contributing to that, and so is David Metz, author of the book Peak Car, and we've got a couple of automotive industry people in the pipeline too. So that'll be 2 weeks' time today. Okay. How many people? We are down to 40. That's quite good. It's a after party we're having now. Does anybody want to have a go at steering the discussion somewhere else or make a point?
Peter, could I just say that Stephen Fiddler should have a copy of the CILT document anyway, and its intended purpose was to get conversations exactly as Steve Goodings described.
Okay, well, everybody's having a go, so we'll see if we can get the forum that actually can kick these things around live. That would be really good fun for me anyway. So yes, I'm happy to take any other contributions. If people would like to just speak, I don't think we've got so many here that we're going to get a clash. If anybody wants to unmute and speak, please do.
Yeah, I'm John Seddon from Coventry here. I think just we can get very hung up as an industry because we're all involved in transport from various ways or means, and clearly that's our key interest at the moment is keeping the transport systems running by all modes and allowing people to travel around. And just looking at the issue of social distancing, it's something which applies to quite a lot of areas of life, you know, not just walking around town or whatever, but there's a lot of very big industries that are dependent on social distancing being lifted or resolved in one way. If we look at, you know, professional sports, cinemas, theatres, pubs, clubs, and so on. And I think we just, you know, the actual issues around social distancing will need to be resolved for those industries as well as the transport industry. So there's going to be a rider, and again, it's a question which we need to look at our politicians for, I suppose. You know, there's going to be pushback ultimately from the public. We've already seen it in the way people are congregating on beaches and the Brecon Beacons or wherever. People want to undertake leisure activities. They want to go on holidays. They want to go to the theatre, cinema, football grounds or whatever. And at some point, the behaviour that we've seen so far, where there's been generally really good compliance with social distancing protocols, will start to erode. And the politicians, I think it's fair to say, have been, yes, as the point was made, partly following the science, but now increasingly following the political sense of what is astute for them in terms of the voters and following voters' behaviour. So we will come a point, I think, where for our industry and for other industries, there will need to be a look at that relaxation, because I don't think we can wait for a vaccine for that. Because the vaccine might be 4 years away. Yeah, I think 4 years is the quickest time from development to vaccine being used properly in previous illnesses, previous viruses. So I think things will move at a continuing pace, I think, and as the industry, I think that's where we start looking at how the transport network will respond as we go from 2 meters to 1 meter, and then we might go to people can sit alongside each other as long as they're wearing face masks. Yeah, I think that would be the sort of protocol that we'll end up going through.
John, there's another point we had in a previous discussion. I mean, I don't want to use the same quip 3 times in the same conversation, but there's another one behind, and in this case, it's a virus. I mean, we might get a vaccine for this one, and then there may be something else. Now, there's a general feeling that we're not living in a world that's stable now, and these things turn up, and this particular virus is of a certain kind. It might be something different next time, but I think we're more likely to be hit than not by something else like this in due course. Mm. So I think the planning, the cerebral futurology that's needed is to be resilient against this sort of stuff. Mm. Thanks for your contribution anyway. On that general point, I mean, are we sharing information? I mean, today we have, and I think the operators have been very good at telling us what their service patterns are. They probably wouldn't do that if it was a wholly commercial situation. Have we got all the information we need out of the various parties to this industry at the moment? Has anybody got any views on that? So it all only falls to me to say again, thank you very much for all the contributions, both from the panelists and from the audience. I've got some lovely appreciative comments in the chat panel, which is great. And I think we do a job with these events that is probably unique, but by bringing together a lot of knowledge in a single place quite intensively for an hour or so and allowing a discussion to flow. Andrew does a great job as the chat host, and I try to be the producer to make sure we covered all bases. So I think we have today, so I'm very pleased, and I hope you are, and thanks for coming, everyone. As I say, we've got another event Friday afternoon, 2 weeks' time, and the subject will be car travel, the future. So good night or good evening, and have a lovely weekend, everyone.